just growing up as a kid, my family spent a lot of time camping, just mucking around in the wildlands. I was in the Boy Scouts. We spent a lot of time tromping around all over the mountains and forests in the Pacific Northwest. And so it was always a really important touchstone for me. Even when I went off to college, I always took the opportunity to get out and hunt, camp, fish, and those kinds of things. And after getting out of college, and kind of a pretty typical scenario where I really didn't know what I wanted to do, I didn't really have a clear career path. One thing that always brought me back was I wanted to be able to spend time in the woods and hopefully make a living at it. So I was lucky enough to sort of discover the field of forestry right after graduating college, and subsequently went off and got a master's degree, and that kind of set me off. I also was coming into this profession, into this field as a master's student during the spotted owl wars in the Pacific Northwest. And what I ended up seeing was a lot of conflict, a lot of battles over science and appropriate management being sort of taken out in the courts and in political arenas. And there really wasn't a voice and a place for people at the local level, people in communities that cared about forests, that made a living off of forests, that cared about biodiversity and water and those kinds of values, to have a forum to work on collective cooperative solutions. And so I really spent all my career working in this field, first of all doing research from kind of a distance, and now through my work with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and here at CSU having kind of an extension type of appointment, I get to actually be involved in creating, sustaining, and managing these kinds of processes. One of the benefits of being at a university and being in a position like this is the impact I have as an individual is actually pretty minor in terms of my own work, in terms of my own research. But I think my enduring impact is really how I interface with students and my colleagues, my employees, as well as people that I interface with around the state. But I think the most special thing for me is always watching students being able to achieve success in their own lives.
It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the semester, Dr. Tony Cheng. With an educational background in both forestry as well as political science, Dr. Cheng's research focuses on promoting resilient, ecological and social systems linked to forest landscapes. Not only is he a professor within the department, he is also a director at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. As a director at the CFRI, Dr. Cheng gets to oversee programs linked to both forest restoration as well as wildfire hazard reduction. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tony Cheng.
Thank you, Alex. Wow, I don't even think I could have memorized all of that without a cheat sheet. So thank you for that, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy Thursday afternoon. Welcome to our off-campus guests.
Sorry, really.
That's okay. There's a chair right there for you. Okay. Yeah, so this is, I'm happy to be invited to be the first speaker of the seminar series. Seminar series are always very fun and important parts of how we build a community around common interests and within a program, and also inviting a lot of folks that we work with as partners. And so one of the things I thought about as I organized the seminar was not just to focus on my research. You're going to get a lot of presentations to focus on research, but to introduce those of you who are unfamiliar with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, as well as sort of other related programs like the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network that I run. And one thing I want to convey to you is the role that the Institute plays within our department, within the college, within the state, as a kind of trying to carve a new path of how we might bridge the gap between scientific research and on-the-ground land management, and really trying to close that distance between that knowledge that's being generated at places like universities and people that really need this information, because the world is changing fairly quickly. Okay. So, as Alex mentioned, I'm on the faculty in the department. I started here in January of 2000, so I am kicking off my 18th year here. I'll soon get another little 20-year service pin from the university, and I don't know if they would give a mug on the 20th. They might give me a pen. I also oversee a program called the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. And the last thing that is important is that part of my appointment is an extension appointment through the university. And this is important because one of the things I want to, as a take-home point, is that work like this and others, colleagues in our department, really embody a land-grant mission of serving communities and managers by being that bridge between the university and people that do work on the ground, but we're trying to do it in different ways. And so I expressed my extension appointment through CFRI and through the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. So a couple other take-homes. One is that the thing that we really try to do and try to craft with our partners is to marry collaboration and science. Okay, and so academic organizations that do research really focus on the science, and then managers that work with communities and landowners and stakeholders focus on collaboration, and quite often there's a missing bridge for that. And so that's something that we try to work at as an institute, and our mantra is that we want to co-produce with our partners locally relevant and actionable science-based knowledge to meet these real-world problems around forest restoration and fire mitigation. And another take-home is that we really craft ourselves in the model of a boundary-spanning organization. And so I won't talk any more about what that means. I think the best thing is to sort of describe the kind of work we do and all those kinds of things. So kind of the outline, the roadmap of the presentation is who we are, why we are. Why is there something called the CFRI? Where did they come from? And then who we are, what do we do, where do we work, how do we do that work? What is our kind of philosophical behavioral orientation, and how do we accomplish that? And then how our impacts, and then kind of come back and reflect on this body of work. And then I like to detract my audience with lots of photos, but they are noteworthy in that they present a whole variety of types of activities that we get involved in, like knowledge exchange between managers and researchers, a lot of new work that's finally coming up where broadcast burning in the state is starting to pick up steam, and being able to be a part of that again, working with my extension forestry partners, and then hiring and training, mentoring students, and providing opportunities for professional development is also part of our mission. So why? And for a lot of you, this is like a rehash story over and over again. But for many of you who are maybe new to the program, new to the state, it's worthwhile sort of recounting our history with wildfire. Okay. In the early 2000s, actually starting in the late 1990s, but certainly in the early 2000s, the Southwest, the Southern Rockies and the Southwest in particular, experienced large, severe wildfires. So these are wildland fires that burned with a size and a severity that have not been recorded in several decades. In some places for about 150 years. And so these were considered uncharacteristic, abnormally large fires down in Arizona. This is a famous shot taken by a Forest Service wildland firefighter of people evacuating Show Low, Arizona from the rodeo Chetasky. Right here in our backyard, this is the Hayman fire. This is Cheeseman Reservoir. Those of you who are local to the area, this is one of the primary water collection and conveyance systems for Denver Water. Denver Water is a water utility that provides water for about 1.5 million people in the Denver metro area. The fire was very large, really took what was a forested landscape and has basically converted into a grass shrub landscape, and in the process deposited, thanks to the kind of granitic soils, if you can even call them soils, deposited an enormous amount of debris into a whole variety of their reservoirs and conveyances. So one of the discoveries at the time then was that a lot of the work that was being done on the ground to mitigate fire risk, to reduce fuels, and dealing with the forest condition were very small in scale, a couple hundred to a few thousand acres. And what the quick realization of these fires was that the scale and scope of planning and management have to match the scale of these new fire realities. And we really didn't know what that meant. As a science community, certainly there was a lot of theories about fuels reduction and landscape scale forest treatment, but there was a lot of uncertainty around it, and there's a lot of controversy around it, right? People are now talking about doing 200,000 to 2 million acre forest restoration projects, which required things like thinning and patch cutting and prescribed burning. Lots of, pretty active interventions that raised a lot of conflict. So in light of that, Congress created institutes at 3 universities, one here at CSU, one at Northern Arizona, and one at New Mexico Highlands University, and collectively we're called the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes. And the mission of these institutes is this, right? This whole centerpiece around developing, compiling, and translating, and working with managers to apply locally relevant, actionable, science-based knowledge to do all these great things. Right? So we all have aspirational missions. This is our aspirational mission. Okay. So that's why we are, right? That's why we now have an institute, and it was an intentional act to place an institute like this at a university, because it leverages not only the research capacity, but it also translates that into our educational programs. Okay. So who we are, we have a lean, mean, good-looking staff of folks that operate as kind of the core of the institute. Many of them who are in this room and on this slide here. I'm the director. Brett Wolk is the assistant director. Come on in. And then we have a variety of folks that run and operate in different program areas. We also don't do any work on our own. Barely anything that we do is on our own. We always partner with a whole variety of scientists, many of them who are in this room, that we have direct partnerships with in terms of projects, in terms of supporting graduate students, in terms of supporting using our work to leverage for other research projects. We work with colleagues at other institutions like CU Denver, Fort Lewis College, other departments, Jason Seibold, Patrick Martin, Rocky Mountain Research Station, a few colleagues here from there. Yeah, a whole variety of folks that are that we really reach out. And so we really see ourselves as an asset to a broader community. Okay, and we really try to keep that as a porous boundary. And for those students, we also hire around 20, and so average between like 16 and 26 students, both undergraduate and graduate students, as part of summer field crews. Since 2011, we have a variety of alumni from those crews that go on and do bigger and better things. In fact, one of our former research associates at CFRI is now the executive director for the Black Hills Forest Resource Association, so they all go on and actually do bigger and better things because of us. Okay, so where do we work? We work statewide generally, but certainly in areas that have high fire hazards around communities and watersheds. These have been identified as high priority areas in things like the Colorado State Forest Service's statewide action plan and a whole variety of, wildfire risk assessments. Okay, and so not surprisingly, the places in the Colorado Front Range and in southwestern and western Colorado, we have a variety of projects. And then each one of these symbols represents different projects, and I'll kind of work through each of them and kind of provide a description, because we do different things with different projects with different partners for different purposes. All right, so that's kind of sort of who we are and where we work. And again, this is kind of more of a list of that mapping graphic. And so as you can see, there's kind of this range of geographic areas and topics. One of our signature projects are these collaborative forest landscape restoration projects. We work with a variety of folks that do work cross-boundary between federal and non-federal lands, especially trying to protect watersheds from wildfire risks and bad things happening, and then we deal a lot. You'll see this word, monitoring the effectiveness of a variety of programs where investments have gone into doing treatments around restoration and forest health and forest resilience, and trying to figure out how to capture ways to measure those outcomes that are meaningful to a variety of audiences. Okay. So kind of what do we do? What just kind of an overarching picture. We really insert ourselves and help co-create and co-manage everything that's involved in the adaptive management cycle. So for who of you in this room are not familiar at all with adaptive management? That's great. Good. So this is kind of a model of the adaptive management cycle with kind of generalized pods of activities that go along with different parts of it. So starting with kind of what we call the front end goal setting aspect, where we're defining goals, objectives, desired conditions, defining where to do restoration, where is it needed, and those kinds of things. And then that flows into developing a monitoring plan. Right? And so if you're going to set up projects and goals and objectives and create big investments into those, developing a way to monitor those outcomes are really important. And so we insert ourselves, and we are inserting ourselves make it sound like we're like crashing a wedding party. We're invited to be parts of these processes by a variety of partners. Especially when you were working with public land management agencies, there's a whole internal process of analysis, planning. It's called the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. So there's a whole internal process, and a lot of the information that we generate goes directly into those analytical processes. So we get to sort of directly inform a lot of work that goes into NEPA analysis that the Forest Service and other agencies do. And then on the back end, we come back and we provide a lot of services and analytical expertise in developing and applying monitoring, and so that's where our field crews come in, where folks are going out and counting sticks and grass all summer long. But that's really important data, and so that data then comes back. We analyze it. We do it spatially and non-spatially, as I'll describe in a little bit, and then help convene and facilitate learning and evaluation opportunities. And that's really trying to plug all that locally relevant science-based knowledge back into a decision process. Okay, and that's really, I think, the key in how we bridge that role between science and research and management, is really kind of filling that. And then in theory, people kind of come together in a kumbaya moment, decide what changes are needed, and then go back into that cycle again with better information. And as you do more projects, you're collecting more information, you're reducing that gap in uncertainty. And the other thing that this collaborative monitoring and adaptive management model helps do is it helps build trust relationships between stakeholders. Because if everybody's involved in shaping the design and implementation of this, they own that knowledge. And when you own knowledge and are able to apply it, it's a powerful thing. And that's what land-grant universities are all about. Okay, so Karina doesn't like this figure, but I'm going to throw it up there anyway. I did call you out on that. So we operate in different scales. And so one of the things that's also a take-home is that we operate at different scales, spatially in the landscape, but also organizationally in decision-making. Okay, so we have stand scale, kind of very project scale, things that are operational, and looking at how treatments are designed silviculturally here on this place, all the way up to fairly large areas in the tens of thousands of acres to look at the effects of treatments in terms of modifying forest structure and fire behavior across those larger areas. We also interact with people very close to the ground, people that are making decisions of what and where silvicultural treatments should be applied, or burns, or those kinds of things, all the way up to people in leadership positions that are making big planning and policy decisions. And so we get to traverse those different scales. Oops. Then another way we cleave our work is that we have one program of work that deals with primarily biophysical attributes, right? Things like fuels and trees and water and bugs and those kinds of things. And so we start at fairly small scales with like tree composition and structure at that stand scale and understory plant communities. And we work our way up to larger scales where those kinds of functions matter and where those processes operate. Okay. And then similarly, we have a program of work that deals with social, economic, and policy, where we facilitate and evaluate and report on collaborative, adaptive management processes. We have folks that collect information and conduct analyses of the social conditions around especially collaboration assessments. And then we have contribute to what we call broader scale monitoring and adaptive management at very high kind of landscape scale, regional policy program effectiveness. Okay, and so it's really cool, right, to be able to do this kind of stuff, right? And I feel like I'm one of the luckiest people at this university because I get to do a lot of things within my position at this in this department as a faculty member, and it's just really been a rewarding thing. And so and a lot of people have been a part of this as well. All right, and it keeps us busy, as you can imagine. We get a lot of doodle polls and conference calls, right? And so there's a mundane part of this. Okay, so let me cruise through a few projects and talk a little bit more about kind of how we do things within the context that we work. So as I mentioned, some of our big signature projects are what's called the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. If you want to know more about CFLRP, as we like to call it, my colleague Courtney Schultz in this department wrote a wonderful article in the Journal of Forestry in 2012 that explains the whole background, legislation, and program of the CFLRP. But there's one CFLRP project here on the Colorado Front Range, so these are not commensurate scales. Here's Fort Collins, here's Colorado Springs, right? So this is a huge area, and these gray blobs are wildfires. In fact, this is an old map because it doesn't have the High Park Fire, which be the big gray blob here, that forms the northern anchor to the southern anchor of the Hayman Fire. And so as you can see, there's lots of areas that have already burned, and there's a lot more areas that are prime to burn. They really are. The fire return intervals and everything we know about fire history on the Front Range. And the issue is that there's a lot of homes here. Okay, and so this is a priority area, a lot of watersheds. The second one is out on the Uncompahgre Plateau. Anybody ever hang out on the Uncompahgre Plateau? Yeah. don't go there. It's really ugly. It's, you know, you'll get mosquito bites. Don't go there. It's really nasty. So here's Grand Junction, I-70. Here's Utah. Moab's out here. So this is far western Colorado. This is the last of the uplift of the Colorado Plateau, of the Grand Staircase that starts from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the top of the plateau is about 10,000 feet in elevation. Okay, so both of these are dominated by federal public lands, but also intermixed with private lands. And I won't get in. I've had other presentations that talk more in detail about these, but these are multi-stakeholder collaborative groups that have been around for a while. They involve federal, state, local government agencies. Mike's Colorado State Forest Service is part of these. They involve conservation organizations, off-highway vehicle groups, the timber industry, so you name it, kind of any stakeholder that have an interest in the state of the forest are involved in these projects, okay? And they are both part of this program called CFRI. And so one role that CFRI plays in these two CFLRPs, this isn't going to work, but anyway, one role we play in these projects is to facilitate really this kind of bridging of the science into planning, implementation, and monitoring. Okay, and so we have developed a variety of approaches to compile existing scientific information about the state of forests and fire risks. We bring them into setting up goals and desired conditions and objectives. At the same time we do that, we help craft these multi-party monitoring plans. So we have monitoring plans for the Uncompahgre, we have one for the CFLRP here in the Front Range. And then we actually then go out and do that monitoring. And so that monitoring are fairly robust across those. So we develop technical reports, you know, kind of things that are usable for managers. And then we also leverage those data and that information and publish in the peer-reviewed journals. Okay, and so that meets our other side of our mission here, is that we also produce new knowledge that can be used and benefit the broader scholarly community. Okay, so we have we write a lot. Right, and so we have a website that's newly revamped and that posts all of our updated information, at least back to 2014. I think we still have to work on getting all other stuff up. Okay, so getting more into the details, we collect data on pre- and post-treatment effects on these following attributes. Actually, Maren Chambers, is Maren here today? There's Maren, oversees a high school forestry intern program with Montrose High School that brings high school kids. The field crew leader is a high school teacher, and Maren trains them on forestry field protocols, and they go out and they collect information on these things, and Maren does QA/QC and does all these great things, and then we take the data, we input them. The cool thing is then at the annual stakeholder meeting, what we try to do, and definitely at the summer field trip, is we get those students back to present those results and talk about their experiences with the community. Right? So this notion that a community owns that information. It's their knowledge that they help develop that contributes to their support and understanding of that program. We've done a variety of socioeconomic monitoring impacts. We primarily look at jobs and revenue and economic effects at the regional scale, and then we do these collaboration case studies. So we did an assessment of collaboration at the beginning. We just finished one midterm. That was Hannah Bergeman's master's program, and we'll do one at the end. So we'll have a longitudinal analysis of collaboration, which is a rarity. It's a great opportunity for us to gain real knowledge about how collaboration works. And then we always bring those information back within the collaborative process. So we drive a lot. We attend a lot of meetings. And so a big foundation to what we do is relationships. Right? We have to get with people and talk and really get to know them and have them to get to know us. So we really invest in long-term relationships. And again, that's the great thing about being at a land-grant university, is that we're not going anywhere. right? We're here, and that's a service to the community. Kind of on a very different note, the U.S. Forest Service has the requirements to create and revise forest plans every 10 to 15 to 35 years or so. It's kind of an interval that's a moving target at this point. But one of the important aspects that forest plans have to do is they have to have a monitoring plan. And they have to monitor things within their forest plan, and they have to monitor attributes outside of their planning area, right, on anything that's going around there. And I don't know if you know this, but the Forest Service right now, in particular, is suffering from a capacity issue. More and more of their budget is being eaten up by wildland fire, and yet they still have these policy requirements they have to comply with. So one of the things that we do as a partner, a science partner, is to work with them to help them formulate things that they already have, but put them in a way that they can be useful for monitoring. Right? So they don't have people that can go out and do research, but we have a research station that we can draw on to bring into this conversation. Okay, and so there's some great partnerships that are occurring across the region. Okay, and one of the projects we're working on right now is that we have a lot of project level data for monitoring, and we're trying to see to what extent we can match that with forest plan scale monitoring. And so Jeff Cannon is working on that, trying to make those scales talk to each other. And I'm not sure that they really do, but that's the short answer. A fairly new project, and this is a great collaboration with Mike Battaglia at the Rocky Mountain Research Station and Jason Seibold here, is to basically do applied research to answer questions about forest management projects in response to a spruce beetle outbreak that's kind of a slow-moving wave through southern and western Colorado that is just kind of eating a lot of trees. Is that right, Seth? Do bugs eat the trees? Yeah? Okay. Eventually, okay. Fair enough. So there's a variety. Again, this is a management action that has a lot of uncertainty and a lot of controversy. And so we step into the role of trying to narrow that gap, and so that we can operate with locally relevant science-based knowledge. And so we have a monitoring and adaptive management process that we help develop with the Forest Service. It's written into the record of decision in their environmental impact statement. So they are now legally compelled to do monitoring and adaptive management. And that's a real breakthrough to really gain that trust of stakeholders, as well as reduce that uncertainty about what do these treatments really do? Do they really have the effect that we think they are? Are our goals even aligned with the things that we want to do? Okay, and so these are opportunities to be able to answer those questions and fill a capacity gap that the agency has right now. And that's kind of cool. And then you know, I haven't yet, but we have our field crews go up and camp out at like 10,000 feet and hang out in the summer and live in the San Juan National Forest, or Gmug National Forest, which is pretty fun. Right? Okay. So coming back to the Hayman fire was a large, high-severity fire that burned a fairly large extent of Denver Water's conveyance. And so starting in about 2004, 2005, Denver Water, actually earlier than that, starting in the late 1990s, Denver Water has taken the lead in investing in forest treatments upstream in order to protect their watershed and water security downstream to the tap. And that's called the Forest to Faucets project. Really clever marketing. Whoever did that was just awesome. And so in many ways, it's a precursor to kind of these investment and watershed investment programs, payment for ecosystem services, where downstream beneficiaries of clean water and reliable water are paying managers upstream to reduce fire risk and those kinds of things. And so that program is now really ramping up. They have a federal land side and they have a non-federal land side. by 2021, between the U.S. Forest Service and Denver Water, just those two organizations alone, they will have spent $72 million to protect watersheds. Okay, that's just Denver Water. Aurora Water, Colorado Springs Utility, we're looking at developing programs here with the City of Fort Collins Utilities and Northern Water. They're all starting to create that linkage between what comes out of your tap here in Colorado is dependent almost entirely on the health of forests upstream. And so a lot of investment is going in, $72 million, and the Forest Service and Denver Water are saying, what are we really getting with that investment? So we're working with them to then come up with metrics and other measures to be able to say, well, how much of that risk has been reduced? If you had that kind of money, where is the best place to put that in terms of priority areas? And then working with partnerships on the ground, like the Upper South Platte Partnership is an example, to actually then drive those priorities down to make sure treatments are getting put in the right place. Okay. And so Ben Gannon, who's here, has been developing this really, with Way, a really awesome model that links all these crazy attributes of fire and fire behavior and severity and soil erosion and water supply and putting it into a dynamic spatial optimization model. Ben's like, oh God, he just butchers this. Sorry, Ben. So this is an example of the output where if you have a certain amount of funding and you're looking at where is the best place to put your funding at a certain level, here's some outputs of how much of your treatment how much of your costs would be avoided due to treatments in these different high value conveyance points. And then you change your budget numbers, you change your scenarios, and those proportions change, and those locations change. And that's all I'm going to say, and you can read Ben's paper and Way's paper when it comes out. Because if I say too much more, I'm just gonna butcher it. So if you have any more questions, ask Way and Ben about this. This is really pretty cool stuff. Okay. We are also working with the state. It's no longer the DNR. The State Forest Service now has taken over this program. It's a Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant Program. This is a program that was authorized by the General Assembly of Colorado in 2013 to expend state-appropriated money to fund treatments around homes, private lands and homes in the wildland-urban interface. So in many ways what the state is saying is that we, the people of the state of Colorado, are putting up real money to reduce risk in communities. It shouldn't just be the federal government's responsibility to do that. So state's putting up real money and has worked with us to do that effectiveness monitoring. We're investing money. What are we getting for that return? And so we have a variety of tools that we are developing, both in the field as well as through some aerial imagery analysis that Jeff Cannon's been working on to look at those change in effects. And then again, we bring that back to the advisory committee that distributes those grants. We say, here's the outputs from our analyses. How might we want to change the grant program so that we make these projects more effective? And so that's a really cool real-time approach to adaptively managing a project to get the outcomes that we want based on the monitoring. And then the latest agreement that we have is with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have a national program that's called the Conservation Effectiveness Assessment Program. Most of they call them SEEPs. SEEP. There are SEEP protocols for rangelands and wildlife and water. There's not one for forests. And so we have the opportunity to kind of pilot to see if there's a way we can develop a SEEP program here for dry forest management. Interestingly enough, the program administrator comes from the Grazing Lands program for NRCS. So this is actually a range project. Maria. again, bringing those results back to inform policy learning, programmatic adaptation, and those kinds of things. And again, these are the trend that we're seeing is our policymakers asking more for what those effect and effectiveness metrics are for these investments in natural resource management. So hopefully by creating robust yet straightforward measures of ecological benefits, that makes the case for sustained funding for those. Okay, and that's an important thing. I don't know if this is the last. I think this is the last. Yeah. There is a sort of fairly new initiative nationally called the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Short, by the people in the know, we just call it the Cohesive Strategy. And this is a demand by Congress, once again, to say, we give managers, the federal managers, a lot of money to do what we think is wildland fire risk reduction and management, and yet there seems to be a lack of a cohesive strategy about how that money has been spent. Okay, and there's a whole variety of General Accounting Office reports that kind of criticize. And so the mandate was federal government, state agencies, local governments, local stakeholders get together and develop these cohesive strategies for how you're going to bring together the forest kind of restoration, fuels reduction side, the protecting community side, what we call fire adapted communities, and effective wildland fire response, and make them work together. Sure makes sense. Okay, and so I think in Colorado we're pretty far ahead on that, and so there's a few great examples of that. There's one here in northern Colorado it's fairly new, called the NOCO Watershed. There's one in the Upper South Platte that kind of tears off of the work that Denver Water, and there's a brand new one that's being stood up down in the San Juan area, the Durango, the upper Rio Grande area that flows into northern New Mexico, and they call it the 232. And it's 2 states, 3 mountain ranges, 2 rivers. Yeah?
That's right.
Okay. Colorado, New Mexico, and the other 3 and 2. Upper Rio Grande and the San Juan. And so these again are efforts to try to bring together multiple stakeholders to try to address a lot of these fire risk issues, and we're just starting to developing some multi-party community-based monitoring strategies for all those projects. Before I kind of get to the impacts, accomplishments, and then open up to questions and those kinds of things, one of our philosophies is that, again, we don't do any work on our own at CFRI. And one of the things that we try to do is we want to create the conditions for local partners to empower themselves to do all this work themselves. So, first of all, it's great to be able to travel down to Durango and hang out and do those kinds of things, but it's a way better thing when the capacity at these local areas is built up enough so they can do their own knowledge development and application. And that's when we know we can have a success. And that's really kind of, if you go back to the tradition of the land grants, right? It was to provide an opportunity for back in the day, rural kids to get a great education, to go out, to create the conditions, to empower themselves to succeed and prosper, and that's what we really try to do. All right, so in terms of what we've done, kind of just throwing out some rough numbers, we have measurable outcomes, so we have on-the-ground plots and measures and data for over 175 projects covering about 40,000 acres. I think it might be more this year. This may be old data, Brett. And you know, that work informs about another 1 million acres of forest land in this state. And so we're kind of trying to scale out some of that impact. Counted up our variety of publications over the years since I've been at CFRI in 2008, and we have a whole mess of reports and white papers and in referee journal publications and those kinds of things. And I think kind of most direct impact of our work is that our publications are cited in NEPA documents that cover about almost 250,000 acres of National Forest System lands, and so you know we really try to make that as an impact. Okay, and this is kind of cool. None of those projects have faced litigation or objections, because they've all been done through this collaborative process. And I think that's kind of a powerful lesson that I think a lot of people understand, but how to do it is a little bit more challenging. Every 5 years or so, the Congress, the law mandates that an independent review of the Restoration Institutes gets conducted. And so this is the most recent one. This was I think conducted by the Meridian Institute. It was funded by the Southwest Region of the Forest Service. And so they conduct a variety of interviews. They look at a lot of our outputs and those kinds of things. And these are just kind of some cherry-picked quotations, admittedly. I'm sure there's a lot of negative. There are good critical comments that are important for learning as well for us. But here's some of the more positive ones about the kind of impact and work that we do around the state. So, you know, I'm up here kind of presenting this stuff, but I really want to acknowledge the CFRI team and the great work they do. We have really hard-working people. They're humble, they're bright, they get along with people really well, and they really take the mission seriously, and they deliver, and we have fun. And so those are all great qualities, and so thank you all for being a part of the team and everybody that's part of our group. Again, the take-homes and coming back, again, hopefully it gives you, you know, kind of describing the portfolio of work that we do, gives you an idea of, you know, when I say co-producing locally relevant actionable knowledge, hopefully now you know what that looks like, what that means. And especially for students that are kind of moving on and looking for career options, there's a whole bunch of great careers out there in industry and agencies and those kinds of things. But this job, this work of co-producing knowledge to apply to real world, real places, that's a really important need, and there's not many organizations that do that. Okay, and so boundary spanning, we span disciplinary boundaries. Right? We span ecological, biological, physical, and social sciences. We span boundaries between agencies. We span landowner boundaries. We span the boundary between the university and the rest of the world. And the world needs boundary spanners. Okay? And so for me, it's really exciting to sort of be trying to, for myself and my colleagues, to be a part of this kind of interesting experiment of how to move this land-grant university into the 21st century. If you know anything about the history of land grants and extension and those kinds of things, it was a very, I think it's fair to say, almost a patronizing model, right? Where we generate the knowledge and all those farmers, ignorant farmers and communities come and lay at the feet of, you know, the high priests and priestesses of knowledge at the university, and we impart that knowledge and they hungrily consume it and bring it back. It's not the case anymore, right? Knowledge is everywhere, right? Everybody has knowledge. Everybody has ways of knowing what's going on in their land and their communities and those kinds of things. And our job is just to figure out, what do you already know? What do you already value? What is it that you want to do, and how can we help you get there? So we don't want to come in as kind of a patronizing approach, but rather than as a partner in co-producing. And I think that's also a hard thing for people that spend a lot of time getting their degrees and, you know, accomplishing kind of status as scientists, but to kind of scale back that humility and say, you know what, yeah, I know a lot of things, but a lot of other people know things too. And that we ought to work together as a knowledge partnership, because the only way that I'm going to be able to, people are going to change their behavior is that they own the knowledge that they create. And that's how you create change. So that's kind of a little preachy kind of thing, but that's where I am right now. So I think we have plenty of time for some Q&A before we raid this line of taps right here. Faucets, all tied to water supplies that come from the forest. Questions? Thank you. Plenty of time.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Yes, Nahalem.
Thanks for that presentation, Tony. Will you talk a little bit about what you're learning relative to investments in treatments on public or private land? So what, $72 million, you know?
Yeah.
What are you learning?
I'm going to put my scientist hat on and say, well, more research is needed.
Yeah.
It depends, and more research is needed. But I think the short answer is that these are all still fairly new. You know, our monitoring programs are still fairly new. Our earliest real, you know, kind of systematized monitoring on the uncompartmentalized plateau is still only at 2011. And so if you think about the kinds of kind of vegetation responses from treatments, it takes, you know, Paula Thornwell, your colleague, estimates it takes at least 4 years for things to really kind of manifest themselves. Otherwise, it's just kind of dirt and chips and all that kind of stuff. And so that's the cop-out answer. The one thing that we do know, and this is no surprise that people that work in the field, is that our data persistently show that in terms of, so if your objective is short-term fire risk, we're achieving short-term risk reduction in terms of crown fire potential. You remove trees, you mow them down on the ground, you don't have anything to burn up here. What we do see almost across every single one of our projects is that the surface fuel stays the same or actually increases. Okay, so no surprise. So then, you know, the question becomes, well, so what? And so I think that's the important sort of how we come back to, like, oh crap, we've created not just distributed discontinuous fuels, but now we have continuous fuels of a higher load than was before. Okay, and so that has implications for fire response and those kinds of things, for soil heating and watershed effects. So these are real questions, right? And so with the Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant, when we presented that initial data, they're like, every grant from now on has to have a plan for dealing with surface fuels. Well, that's really hard. And so how then can we use that grant program to plow investments in things like chippers? So you can move that stuff off-site, chip it, and kind of store it over here, right? Trying to find kind of short-term solutions to deal with that short-term issue with the hope that eventually those things will either burn or they'll just decompose in 20 years. So 20 years before the next fire, you're good. So the other thing is that we're also seeing with treatments a lot of native plants that have been suppressed by shade are coming up. So we see a lot of flowers and those kinds of things. And one thing that we're looking at exploring with Seth Davis is, do we see an increase in things like pollinators? Right? So pollinators are a really hot topic in those kinds of things. Can these kinds of treatments actually create and expand habitat for pollinators? So that would be an ecosystem benefit that we can kind of show as an antecedent. With the water stuff, it's really scale dependent, right? And so if you have a small area, then be patient with me. If you have a small area and you direct investments at that area, you have a higher likelihood of achieving very quick returns on investments with the first increment of treatments that you do, up to about 40% of the watershed treated. As you scale up, those investments just have a smaller impact, right? It's diluted within the larger scale of the watershed. And so it really comes down to, where are your values? What are the values that you really care about on the land? So spatial analysis becomes a really important tool in answering these questions. Where on the landscape are the values you want to conserve and restore? And then within that, then we can prioritize. But if it's just like the Cache La Poudre, there's not enough money. There's not enough money in anybody's budget to be able to treat all those acres. So really really focusing people's goals, right? How do they define goals? At what scale do they define goals? And what are the metrics of those outcomes? Those are things that we can now help walk people through so that those goals are achievable. And they're reportable back to say, look, Denver Water, this $72 million investment had this impact on reducing your risk in a real way, or at least in model land.
I have a question. So we're streaming this to CSFS
Yes.
people, and Tim Reeder, he's got a good juicy question.
Oh, Tim.
Is CFRI seeing increased competition among various collaboratives across the state, competition for members and messaging, expertise, funding, etc.?
So CFRI seeing more competition among collaboratives for membership funding and those kinds of things. You know, I don't know if I'm in a good enough position to know that, because I think there's sort of a self-selection bias that we work with the collaboratives that are already successful. And I think this is a real concern, right? I think it's a very real concern that the winners keep winning, right? The high capacity collaborative groups that have resources, that can write grants, that can match grants. All grants now that are coming through the feds is a matching one-on-one. So Costilla County in southern Colorado versus Boulder County, who's going to come up with the best match? Right? So I think we're already seeing it, and I think we've already seen places like North Park and northwestern Colorado, more rural communities that don't have a strong tax base, that are already kind of lagging economically. They're not getting these kinds of things, and so I think we're already seeing it. And yeah, that's a bigger public policy issue. It's a good question. By the way, I didn't repeat. Should I repeat Nehalem's question, or is that too late? How do? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Okay. I'm new to Colorado and
welcome.
New to the Colorado Farm Range.
Yeah.
And the CFRI project is working on the Colorado Farm Range, high priority. So, I mean, what is the reason that there's a high fire vulnerability there than other areas? Yeah. So, Colorado Front Range, it's high priority. Why is there such a high vulnerability? Is that? Yeah. Okay. Ecological reason. Yes. Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors, as many complex social ecological problems are, and so so in looking at fire histories, so we have fairly good fire histories along the Front Range. So good fire histories that go back to probably the mid 1800s, and then okay to not so great fire histories that go back to about 1300 to 1200. So kind of isolated pockets of data where we can derive fire histories from tree rings and those kinds of things. In general, we know that the fire return interval, the fire frequency in the Front Range in general is between about 15 and 40 years. So fires came through when the conditions were right and were fairly large in spatial extent, but were also low in severity. And so we have lots of remnant trees that survived all those fires because they were low severity fires. Okay. when human settlement came into the Front Range, caused a lot of changes in the fuels, the fuel structure at a landscape scale, as well as then the fire regimes. And so livestock grazing stripped off the fine fuels, the grasses, logging, mining for logging and for building cities really changed the forest structure, so that as we sort of and then the third is in the early 1900s, the U.S. Forest Service and in cooperation with the states enacted a policy of aggressive suppression of fire. So those three factors alone created a situation where fires that used to burn 15 to 40 years were eradicated from the landscape. Okay, so as you move forward through the 20th century, you have a fuel buildup, right? You have the buildup of fuels that would have otherwise burned somewhat frequently and spatially extensively. And then, starting in about 1960, the growth and development of lands, so human development in the foothills and the Front Range, increased the population of homes there. And so people don't want homes to burn, so when fires did ignite, you had to put it out. So it perpetuated the cycle of fire suppression, fuel buildup, and those kinds of things, till you get to the point where any fire ignition in even moderate fire weather conditions is going to blow up. And so it is a very flammable condition. Naturally, and then you have just us. We have ignition source. So naturally, the only ignition source is lightning. Now we have, I think human ignition sources are, I don't know, like, Dan, you might know this, 4 to 1 now. Four ignition sources for every lightning strike sources. So we now have ignitions of fires in February, all the way till November. And so our fire seasons are longer, our ignition sources are expanded, and our flammable fuels are highly flammable. And so, does that answer your question? So Smokey Bear gets a bad rap, but Smokey's message, and those of you that at Dan Binkley's seminar the other day, his message was, only you, humans, can prevent forest fires. You ignition sources out there. Yeah, Andres.
I just had I was thinking about that last question. I guess it kind of ties into King's question as well. Communities with lower tax bases, like, is there any effort from CFRI to sort of reach out to maybe underserved areas of the state? Or is it sort of a numbers game where, the Front Range is the most, there's the most going on here, therefore it requires the most attention? Is there any efforts on CFRI's part to reach out to, say, low-income communities in southern Colorado, northwest Colorado?
Yeah, it's a fair question. So the question is there any efforts by CFRI to reach out to lower resource communities to put that work that we do with rich communities, quite frankly? And so the answer is that that our participation in those projects follow the Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant Program, which did intentionally set aside funding to support those efforts in lower income communities. And so we go down there and we do that kind of work. But it is still fairly limited. And it's primarily in the San Luis Valley and in southwestern Colorado. And despite there's sort of this mythology that only rich people own homes in the mountains of the Front Range. That is not true. There's a lot of low-income people and low mobility people that live up in the mountains. Not for lifestyle, not because they're have a second home in the city, but that's just what happens. So dispel that myth.
So my question revolves around. So you showed some of those. They cherry-picked really positive quotes, and there are also some critical comments.
Yeah.
What are some of those critical comments that you guys have taken and learned from and actually been able to increase be able to address those.
Yeah. So what are some of the more critical comments that were from this assessment report? And it's really tears off in Juris's question is that we are seen as a front range only server, and you see our portfolio, and that makes sense, right? I mean, that's where the funding is. That's where a lot of work. There's a lot of acres out there. And so one of the things that we then are trying to commit to is to reach out to kind of forested areas like in the Rio Grande National Forest, which is in the San Luis Valley, and those areas that really don't get a lot of attention. And how can we leverage the work we do in other places to be able to provide services with folks like that? And so there's sort of a capacity issue on our side. But I think just even raising that as an awareness and bringing that attention and to always sort of keep that in front of us, I think is a fair thing if we are really to sort of fulfill our land grant promise. So I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you, and see you at the Mayor if we can go.